I just want to preface this by saying that Donald Trump's soothing words to the children of America do not fool me for a second. Donald Trump has made America a far less safe place by promoting racism, bigotry, intolerance. We are talking about the man who, during his presidential campaign, said, "I could walk down the street and shoot somebody and people would still vote for me." Keep that in mind.
Tonight, after the deadliest US school shooting in 6 years, a father who lost his own son in the Colorado movie theater shooting tells me that change is on the way. And the former US Surgeon General on treating gun crime as a public health menace. Also ahead, help and healing. The renowned concert pianist James Rhodes on how he used music to cope with his own trauma that he suffered when he was sexually abused as a child. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the program. I'm Christiana Manpour in London. The Bible warns us not to worship false gods. And yet, it does seem that much of America is indeed worshipping at the altar of the gun gods, hiding behind the Second Amendment, even fear-mongering, with false claims that those who want sensible, safe gun control are just trying to take their guns away. As another 17 innocents are mowed down, this time in Florida, we watch aghast here abroad, knowing that there are solutions and knowing that it is not rocket science. Here in Britain, for instance, the worst ever gun massacre killed 16 young children in Dunblane, Scotland. It was 1996. The country then tightened up its gun laws. No mass shootings since. That same year in Australia, a man massacred 35 people. The Conservative government then enacted a hugely successful gun buyback program and tightened up its laws. No more mass shootings. The unbearable ordeal in Florida leads to the predictable hand-wringing mass media attention, thoughts and prayers and tweets. And each time the question, will this be the one that changes the way we are? Joining me now, Tom Sullivan, the father of Alex Sullivan, who was killed when a shooter ended 12 lives in the Aurora movie theater, Colorado 2012. Tom is in Denver today, working to oppose a series of gun rights bills. And we're also joined by Vivek Murthy. He's the former US Surgeon General who believes that gun violence is a public health issue, which should be no different to how we handle car crashes or alcoholism. Gentlemen, welcome both to the program on this truly horrendous day. And I want to start by asking you, Mr. Sullivan, the inevitable question: what are those people, the victims, their families going through in Florida today? What are they thinking after all these years of all this violence?
Well, I can tell you from personal experience that initially there's shock, and this is a really important time. I always said, the decisions and the things we did in the first 24 to 48 hours helped us on our recovery 5 years later. Right now you're just trying to get a hold of family members. You might have to go over to the coroner's office and identify your child. You need to begin contacting the funeral home and start to get that. And in our case, I didn't have to call anybody to let them know that Alex had been murdered because it was on TV. We were one of the first fatalities that was identified, afterwards. It might be a little bit different for them, but people are going to start coming, and you need to, embrace those your friends and family that come towards you.
Tom, how do you feel? How have you coped all these years later? And I indicated that you are really on the front lines of the battle to try to get sensible bills through, to try to make your world safer when it comes to guns.
Well, as I say, the first day, in our case, July 20th is Alex's birthday, and that's the day that he was murdered. And I remember saying to my wife and to all of his friends that were there with us that day that we would celebrate this day like we had the 26th prior to that, and there would always be time for grieving, later on, and then you had to continue to move ahead. At Alex's at the cemetery. After we had, they were getting ready to put Alex into the ground. The director came over. We stood there next to it, and he came over to us and said, Mr. Sullivan, he says, you can come back. He said, but right now, he said, nobody is going to move until you do. And I know he just meant that for that particular time, but I've used that onward because people are looking to us to see, what it is we're going to do, and I've taken that as a challenge to do something.
Well, I'm going to come back in a second to explore the challenge and whether you're hopeful. But I want to first ask Vivek Murthy, as the former top doctor, the former Surgeon General of the United States, you had a heck of a time trying to convince people that actually gun crime, gun deaths, were as significant a public health issue as alcoholism, as all the other terrible, public health issues that we live with. Why is that?
Well, Christiane, it is absolutely the case that gun violence is a public health issue. Whenever you have large numbers of people who are dying for clearly preventable reasons, that constitutes a public health issue. And that's what we have when it comes to gun violence. The sad truth is that the majority of the public in the United States understands that. It is, unfortunately, many of our elected leaders who have chosen to either not recognize that or to put that aside and not treat gun violence with the priority and urgency that it requires. And that is truly unfortunate because while there are a number of actions we need to take to address gun violence in America, legislators have an essential role to play in passing laws that can help us stem the tide of violence in our country.
Doesn't it just make you wring your hands in frustration and hopelessness when you think, A, your confirmation was held up because of this very issue and because of the way you thought about this issue, held up by NRA lobbying, but also we keep hearing the same sentiments after these terrible crimes. We keep hearing the same sentiments from those elected officials, and yet, so far, nothing much has changed.
Well, it is heartbreaking and it is frustrating, and I can understand why so many people are angered about this as well, because this is not the first time we have had a mass shooting, and sadly, it may not be the last time, but there does not seem to be any meaningful action that our legislators have taken at a federal level to ensure that this does not happen again. This school that we are talking about today in the news, Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, is a school that I grew up not too far from in South Florida. It's a school that I've visited for academic meets when I was growing up there. And, I carry with me a bracelet that was given to me by the parent of Anna, a young girl who was killed at the Newtown shooting, sadly, several years ago. It's this bracelet right here that I carry on my wrist. And I carry it with me as a reminder that despite the frustration and anger and disappointment that I may feel at the lack of action that our legislators are taking, that it's important to move on because children like Anna, children like the 17 who gave up their lives today, children like Mr. Sullivan's son, and so many others have lost their lives. Children who have the right to live full lives, who wanted nothing more than to be fulfilled, to go to school and learn. And they are paying the price for our inaction as a country. That is unconscionable. And that's why I think it is so important that we do what Mr. Sullivan and so many others are doing, which is to use our voices to push for the change that we need, to use our votes to support people who will actually back those changes and ensure that they happen so that we won't have to suffer more and more tragedies like the one that we're hearing about.
Let me ask then, Mr. Sullivan, because you said that you confronted it, you moved on in a way to fight this scourge, and you even stood for election, but you are lobbying there right now. First of all, what is the bill you're lobbying for, and do you have hope that actually things will change? What are you seeing on the local level?
Well, here in Colorado, following the theater shooting, they brought up 7 different what they called gun bills. 5 of them passed, including things such as background checks, limiting high capacity magazines. Those are the bullets that will be fed in there, and we have gone each year and defended those. Like yesterday, they're trying to bring up a law to allow people to concealed carry without getting a permit. That would mean all you had to do was buy it off the shelf and put it underneath of your jacket and you were good to go, as opposed to getting some type of training to show that you're proficient in it. And we have made, progress here. When we limited the high capacity magazines, we had another shooting, shortly after that, in November, December of 2013, a high school shooting, and that student was only able to buy a 9-round magazine to go into his shotgun. And as tragic as it was that he killed one student and then killed himself, he wasn't able to buy a 33 or 100-round drum like the shooter in the theater did. So the things we've done here in Colorado are working, but more needs to be done.
It's incredibly hopeful to hear you say that. I want to play for both of you what President Trump said today about the situation. He spoke directly to the children. Just listen.
I want to speak now directly to America's children, especially those who feel lost, alone, confused, or even scared. I want you to know that you are never alone and you never will be. You have people who care about you, who love you, and who will do anything at all to protect you.
So obviously a heartfelt appeal to people, trying to comfort them. But the anything at all to protect you needs a little bit of dissecting. Because last February, President Trump eliminated a regulation that keeps guns out of the hands of people who either receive disability benefits because of mental health. And, he started by saying this was all about mental health. So how do you, again, square that circle? What do you think of what President Trump just said?
Well, I appreciate his sentiment, to try to bring comfort to children. I appreciate him addressing the country and speaking directly to children. This is a time where what ultimately is going to matter is what we do beyond words. It's our actions that are going to speak volumes and that are going to make a difference in the lives of people. And what we've unfortunately seen time after time again is that politicians will say words that are comforting but not back them up with action. So what I'm most interested in is, what is President Trump going to do? And if he needs some suggestions, I can give him a few. Number one, he can reinstitute funding for studying the causes and solutions to gun violence, funding that has been choked off by Congress for decades now. The other thing that he can do is to support the expansion of high-quality mental health services. But I say this with a caveat. While that is a necessary part of the solution, it is not entirely sufficient. And to pin gun violence as a whole on people who are mentally ill is actually incorrect. It risks stigmatizing people with mental illness, and it actually leads us away from some of the fundamental drivers of gun violence. We also need a increased focus on gun safety. And we need to ask the deeper question, which is, why is this happening in the first place? What is happening with our level of emotional well-being in America? The truth is, we have an emotional well-being crisis in our country. It's one that we are not talking about or discussing. It's one that I saw clearly as Surgeon General as I traveled to communities across America. And I think addressing emotional well-being is going to be an essential part of addressing violence in America.
Indeed, and we're going to dig into that in our next segment. But for the moment, former Surgeon General Vic Murthy, thank you for joining us. And of course, Tom Sullivan, we applaud your struggle to keep this country safer. And we remember your son on this evening as well. Thanks for joining us. As I said, our first thoughts for healing are with the victims in Florida, but much has been made of the trauma and the mental health condition of the shooter. So why is it that some take the most violent option and others who faced even worse physical and emotional trauma take exactly the opposite track? My next guest is the internationally renowned British pianist and author James Rhodes. For years as a child, he was horrendously sexually abused by one of his school teachers. Later, he descended into drug addiction, depression, and despair. But as he was hitting his emotional rock bottom, Rhodes heard a piece of music by Bach that would change his life forever. His new book, Fire on All Sides, follows his continuing battle with trauma and the acute anxiety he feels while he's touring and performing. And I went to the Steinway Piano showroom here in London to meet him and listen to his story of healing and redemption. James Rhodes, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
Well, and we are here in what to me looks like a palace of Steinways. It's the Steinway showroom in London. How do you feel?
It's amazing. It's incredible. It's like I look up on the wall. I mean, these are my heroes, my childhood heroes. I was a weird kid. And I mean, this is, for me, it's like a geek heaven.
So you say you were a weird kid.
Yeah.
And you did have an exceptionally, almost unbelievably devastating childhood. I want to know how music saved your life.
Sounds very melodramatic, doesn't it? To say music saved our lives. Like you said, there were difficult, challenging things happening, and it felt like everything was hostile and everything was bad. And then when I was 7, I heard a piece of music by Bach, and literally everything changed. It was like, for the first time in my life, 2 things happened. Firstly, I had a way of expressing things that I couldn't find the words to express, because that's what music does, it goes underneath words. And secondly, I realized that if something that beautiful exists in the world, it can't be 100% awful.
I want to ask you about the awful before I ask you for the beautiful antidote. From 6 to 10, you were relentlessly sexually abused.
Yeah, well, we soften that word, don't we? We use words like abuse or molested or raped, I think is the appropriate word. But again, I don't think it's necessary to, or even possible or helpful to quantify trauma. We all undergo trauma. Pets die, parents get divorced, we live in poverty, we deal with disease, we witness domestic abuse, we get bullied at school, we suffer from sexual abuse and rape and other crimes.
But we don't all, James.
Yes, I think we do. I think I cannot think of a single person I have met who has not gone through some level of trauma.
You were 6 when this started. What happened?
When it started, there was a gym teacher at the school I was in, and I mean, looking back now, it's so crystal clear that there was grooming involved and, all the things that we know about now, but, this was 1981 and we didn't know so much about it then. And which again, I find quite difficult to get my head around, because there were times when I was found by other teachers with, blood coming down my legs and hysterical and just sobbing and yet nothing happened. Like nothing happened. I was allowed to continue and continue and continue, and to the point where, it literally broke my back.
Literally?
Yes, I had to have 3 operations to repair it shattered the base of my spine, and I now have titanium rods, so I feel a little bit like a bionic man, but again, it's just more, it's like it's always a part of me. It's one of the things that's quite hard to deal with. It's still there.
So, play the piece of music that at least started to make you feel normal again.
Because it's written by Bach, and it starts he wrote it in memory of his wife who died, just the love of his life. And so it starts really in quite, almost like funereal. On like that, but then it's like a set of variations. There are moments of absolute peace where he, for example, so beautiful, right the way through to the heroic. And on, and then the virtuosic. The whole thing thing. It's just this massive adventure. It's a love letter to, if you knew someone you loved was dying and you were lucky enough to get to say goodbye to them, this is what you would say.
I want to ask you about your emotions when you first heard it, because as you say, it's every emotion. I want to say that perhaps you were dying, at least inside.
No question. I mean, I was dead. There was nothing. It was just, I was like, I mean, now we know all the terms, like I was dissociated, PTSD and dissociative identity disorder. I would disappear for hours, lose track of time, lose days. I didn't know what was happening. Everything was just shades of grey.
Along with the music, how did you get yourself back into a place where you could feel normal again? I mean, you write very profoundly.
I didn't. Is anyone? I'm not there. I don't have a normal life. I'm on an airplane 300 hours a year. I walk out on stage alone in front of 1,000 or 2,000 people. I've had car crash relationships. I have no idea in most social situations how to act. And I think a lot of us feel like life is messy. Like over in America, you guys have this weird idea of the pursuit of happiness. Like it's something that we have. It's not. That's distraction. The new iPhone, the next Tinder date, whatever it is. It's actually, what's wrong with feeling sad? What's wrong with feeling a bit messy and having kind of pretty awful Instagram selfies? And I mean, we have this idea that everyone else's life is perfect, and God forbid we feel a bit fragile or a bit down. You can lose yourself in music or in painting or in writing, and it's an antidote to the world in which we live today.
And so many people are looking for that antidote, and not enough attention, even in our Western rich democracies, is paid to people's mental health.
Isn't that sad? I mean, that to me is the saddest thing.
Your first wife, the mother of your child, is American.
Yeah.
And you had an extraordinary situation. You wrote a memoir called Instrumental about what happened to you as a kid.
Yeah.
Pick up the story. Your wife wanted it not to be published.
Not just not to be published. I mean, it's a book about music. It's a love letter to my son. It's a love letter to music. But because it's a memoir, of course it talks about what happened to me with the kid. It would be so weird just to have talked about the good things and not the tricky things. And then what was so extraordinary was that there were no issues with libel, there were no issues with privacy, but it ended up taking 18 months and the Supreme Court and $2 million in legal fees to publish it. And the idea was that she said that I was intent on deliberately inflicting catastrophic psychological harm on my son by publishing this book. And the really scary thing was it wasn't just the book that they wanted banned. It was a gagging order that would stop me from speaking or writing in any medium anywhere in the world about almost any aspect of my past.
How old is your son?
He's just turned 15.
And when that was coming out?
13, 14. But again, she even acknowledged that he wasn't going to read the book.
But that's what I was going to
It's not a
say. Did you
children's
want him to read it?
No, of course not. I mean, it's like take a movie director who makes a very violent movie with rape scenes. They're not going to show their 12-year-old, 13-year-old kid. But should they be forced to not make those kind of movies on the off chance that kid might see excerpts of it on the internet at some unknown point in the future? No, of course not. What I did with my son was I sat him down and I said, look, we're best friends. When I was a kid, those things you learn about at school now, about the dangers of the internet, about why we don't go off with strangers, about, being groomed and sexual abuse, that happened to me. And I didn't talk about it for a long time. I thought it was my fault. And as an adult, I got very sick because of it. And I went to hospital and I started to talk about it. And slowly but surely I got better. And now I have this wonderful life and I'm here and I see you all the time. And that to me is a much more important, valuable message to a child than, don't ask, we're not going to talk about this, it never happened, we must pretend everything's fine.
Do you feel somewhat liberated, maybe the wrong word, but the idea that the Me Too movement is now so front and center,
Yeah.
that there is no more shame
No, that's
about
not true.
talking about these things?
That's not true at all. There will always be shame. In fact, the Me Too movement is even more powerful because despite the shame, people are talking. It is not easy to talk about this. I feel permanent shame talking about it. Even though rationally I know it wasn't my fault, I still, in my mind, colluded in it, and that's why we feel ashamed.
Where are you now? Where is James Rhodes today, mentally, in terms of your health, your physical health, your emotional health?
I don't know how to answer that question really, because it's changeable, and I think we're all changeable, and I just wish more of us were slightly more transparent about how challenging we find life, because then we don't feel so alone.
Did you ever imagine that out of all that pain, you would end up giving so much joy to the world, to people?
That's a lovely thing to say. I would argue that Gluck gives joy. Bach, Beethoven, Prokofiev, Chopin, Liszt, Brahms, right now. I mean, there is a lot of... Yeah, you're right. Look, there's a lot of joy out there. And sometimes we need to know and be slowly, gently nudged into the right direction where that joy is. And it's about noticing those little things and focusing on that, I guess.
Play us out, James Rhodes.
Play us out? All right. Maybe a little bit of Gluck. This is a lovely piece of music.
Profound beauty and even peace on a day such as this. That is it for our program tonight. And remember, you can always listen to our podcast, see us online at amanpour.com, and follow me on Facebook and Twitter. See you again tomorrow night when the legendary film director Ridley Scott joins us, and we'll also have a conversation on love in our digital age. Thanks for watching, and goodbye from London.